Hey everyone, and welcome to my review of the Hori Split Pad Pro Daemon X Machina edition. I've always hated the feel of the Joy-Cons and the Switch as a whole, so I've very rarely used it undocked. The only times I really used it was to install a new game before I went to play, or when I was playing Xenoblade Chronicles 2, as I played a lot of that in bed at night. After a half hour or so of holding it, my hands would start to cramp up and become really uncomfortable, so I started to look for something to make it easier. At first I was looking at Switch cases or grips, but each of those had different issues, like being too bulky to let the Switch still use the dock, or being so small as to be insignificant. It wasn't until someone I knew mentioned the Split Pad Pro in a Discord that I used that I found out about it, and I ended up ordering it the next day. Since then I've been using it for about 2 weeks, and I thought it'd be good to put down my thoughts so far. Also, just as a quick note, because the controller can only be used in handheld mode, I obviously couldn't capture any footage of me playing anything with it, but I have tried it with a variety of different games. I thought it would make sense to talk about the aspects of the controller in the order you'd first notice them, so I'll start with how the controller looks. Black and red is kind of my aesthetic if you haven't noticed already, so I definitely like how it looks, although there are a couple of nitpicks that I have. For one, the text for the assign and turbo buttons is bright orange, and I wish it was red to fit with the rest of the controller. Also, the controller is branded as the Daemon X Machina edition, but outside of the general colour scheme and the design of the X button, there's little about it that is even vaguely related to the game at all. It doesn't matter much really, but it's probably the least effort they could have put in while still calling it a special edition. That being said, I don't think I've ever seen a non-Daemon X Machina edition, so it seems a bit of a weird distinction to make either way. The controller has two main extra features over the Joy-Cons, though it does also have a few things missing. First, what's missing? There's no wireless at all, nor rumble, gyro, or NFC. This means that there are a number of games that can't be played properly with the split pad, and a couple which can't be played at all. The controller kind of turns your normal Switch into a Switch Lite in terms of game compatibility. The lack of NFC also means no amiibo support when using the split pad, though that is generally less useful anyway. The two extra features, while nice, aren't the most useful things ever, with those being turbo buttons and extra paddle buttons. The paddle buttons on the back can be rebound to any button for easier access, or rather, any button except L3, R3, or the plus and minus buttons, and only on their respective pad. As a split pad has no way of communicating between sides, the paddle can only be rebound to buttons on their respective side, which leaves the left side paddle feeling kind of redundant. Perhaps that's just because of how I use it, where I tend to rebind it to any button I need to hold, such as B in Animal Crossing so I can run more comfortably. I could see it being useful in games where you have to press down on the D-pad to use items or something, but it's a shame that it's not as useful as it could be. I've run into a number of situations where I wanted to rebind one paddle to B and another to X, but that isn't possible in the current setup. The turbo buttons are the same in that they can only be rebound to buttons on their respective side, which makes the left side turbo even more useless by default. I can't think of a game that has ever asked me to mash the ZL or L buttons, not any button on the D-pad, because that would be insane. Outside of that though, the right turbo has provided some use so far, especially when crafting large amounts of objects in Animal Crossing or in some of the torture attacks in Bayonetta 2. There are 3 different settings for turbo: off, where it obviously does nothing; hold, where you hold the button you want to turbo and it repeats while you hold the desired button; or auto, where you assign the button you want to turbo and it runs automatically until you unbind it. I prefer the hold variation personally because auto is perhaps a little too fast, and is also easy to accidentally mess things up by leaving it on, but it does have some use, so it is a worthwhile inclusion. To assign a button to the paddles or turbo, you hold the respective assign button on the pad you want to use, and then tap the button you want to assign it to. So if I wanted X on the paddle, I'd hold the assign button on the right pad and then press X. From that point, the paddle will register as X when hit. To unassign, simply hold the assign button again and tap the paddle. For turbo, the process is slightly more complicated. The first assignment works similarly. I'd hold the left turbo button and tap ZL to assign it, and from that point on I could hold the ZL to repeat its inputs. From this though, I can also assign it to ZL again, at which point the input would repeat infinitely until unbound. I'd then have to hold the turbo button and press ZL for a third time to unassign it. I'm not a fan of this personally, as having to go through the extra auto repeat step every time you want to unassign a button can easily cause issues. I honestly wish they'd left it at the hold option, though I'm sure other people will get more use out of the auto option than I will. As for how the split pad feels, it's a bit of a mixed bag. It's a very thick controller, and it feels kind of unbalanced because of it. There's a lip between the controller and the Switch on the front and back, which doesn't get in the way exactly, but it's definitely a bit strange. The controller also has a slightly rough texture. It's intentional to provide better grip, but in some places it feels a bit sharp, especially near the seams. The face buttons feel quite nice though, with much more resistance to them than the Joy-Con buttons. They are however quite tall, especially the A and X buttons, which at times can get in the way, especially when moving quickly between the B and A buttons. Speaking of tall, the sticks are also massive, which combined with the thickness of the controller leaves them feeling just a bit too high to be comfortable for long play sessions. The D-pad feels very flat and mushy. It's not the worst I've ever used, but it's far from the best. The back bumpers are also quite soft, with very little feedback, but the triggers feel great. The paddles are also surprisingly nice, slightly clicky with just enough force that you're not pressing them by accident, while still being quite easy to use. These paddles feel way better than the DS4 paddle attachment if you've used that. Finally, there's the plus, minus, home, share, assign and turbo buttons, which are all totally adequate, but don't stand out at all. Considering how infrequently you'll be using those though, I wouldn't complain about that. So as I said earlier, the main reason I picked this up was because I wanted a more comfortable way of using the Switch handheld, and for that it does an almost perfect job. The flatness of the Switch with Joy-Cons would cause my hands to become really uncomfortable after a while, and the split pad fixes that almost completely. The extra grip makes the Switch feel lighter, purely because the weight distribution is so much better. Just in the last few weeks since I've gotten it, I've used the Switch handheld way more than I thought I would, and for longer than I previously would have been able to as well. That being said though, it's still not perfect, especially for more demanding games. I've mainly used this so far to play Animal Crossing and Bayonetta 2, and despite being the Daemon X Machina edition controller, I wouldn't recommend it for action games at all. It's usable, sure, but I found myself missing inputs even more than usual, and holding the Switch was still distracting. Honestly, this complaint isn't the controller's fault, and it is infinitely better than using the Joy-Cons, but the experience of playing action games handheld is pretty terrible regardless. Slower paced games, though, like Animal Crossing are great, or games which don't require a ton of dexterity would be good too. Due to the added height to the controllers, you can only kind of use the Switch's kickstand with them attached. It is possible by putting a couple of coasters or something under the kickstand to give it the extra height to level it out, but I could see people finding that annoying. Then again, I've yet to find a use for it myself, and I've literally only used the kickstand while making this video to find out if it worked. The controller does also change how you insert the Switch into the dock. While it still fits perfectly well, and personally I find it a bit easier to place just because I have more to hold onto while doing it, it's definitely a tighter fit. There were a number of times when I was getting used to it where I'd pull it back out after docking because I wasn't sure if it had docked properly. The controller has some plastic tabs on the back which rest on top of the dock when inserted, and they also provide a little extra rigidity when handheld, though I'm not sure why they're there really. There were also some issues with the right hand controller when docking the first time, as its thickness can conflict with the area where the HDMI and power cables come out of the dock, but that was easily fixed. If they were to make another version of this controller, I'd like it if they included the missing features, but besides those, there are a few changes I'd like them to make. For one, I'd like the A and X buttons to be a bit shorter, as sometimes I have issues when moving from the B buttons to either of them. Another change I'd like is if the back of the controller were curved more, so as to be flat with the back of the Switch. As it is, there's a tiny lip, which I mentioned previously, which I think could easily be removed. Finally, and most importantly, I really want to be able to assign the paddles and turbo buttons to buttons on either side of the controller. The left paddle, and even more so the left turbo, are basically useless right now, so this would be essential in a second version. As for whether or not I'd recommend this, I think at its full price it's a bit too much. I managed to get it for £10 less than its RRP, and I still think even at that price it was too much for what it is. At its full price of £50, and with no wireless capabilities, no rumble, no gyro, or no NFC, it's clearly too expensive. Perhaps at $30 I'd be more likely to recommend it, but as it is, it's too expensive to have wide appeal. If you're happy with the Joy-Cons as they are, then I don't think the split pad is worth picking up. If you're like me though, and you hate the Joy-Cons with a burning passion, and just want a more comfortable way to use the Switch handheld, then the split pad is definitely worth picking up, although maybe see if you can find it cheap somewhere. So, those are all my thoughts on the Hori Split Pad Pro Daemon X Machina edition. I hope I've helped you decide whether or not to get it during this video, and if you have any questions, feel free to let me know on my Twitter or Discord, linked in the description, or in the comments below. Thanks for watching.
Now